Hola muchachos, ¿qué tal? Buenos días. Aquí tienen el horario para hoy, jueves. Hoy es jueves, el 24 de abril. Here is your agenda for today. Learning target is to talk about my daily activities and free time preferences. Your warm-up question for today, please go ahead and jot down in your notebook. ¿Cuántas horas duermes cada noche? ¿Cuántas horas duermes cada noche? How many hours do you sleep every night? Duermes is the verb dormir, the verb to sleep that you may recognize. And so respond in the yo form and then use the number, the amount of hours you sleep every night. Por ejemplo, normalmente yo duermo 7 horas cada noche. Normalmente yo duermo 5 horas cada noche. Normalmente yo duermo 9 horas cada noche. Minutes in Spanish, if you want to be a little bit more precise, minutos. 10 minutos, 30 minutos, 45 minutos, if you want to add. Or you could say media, 7:30 horas, 7.5 hours. And that's your warm-up question for today. Nothing due for today. No homework. No homework due for next class for the weekend. And your new notes today are on what we call stem changing verbs. You'll do a little guided practice and then some pair practice with your elbow partner, small groups, and that will be the agenda for today. So stem changing verbs you can see on page 161. So I'll give you guys a moment to get there in your textbooks. As you guys are making your way there, I just want to run back the types of verbs that we've seen so far. So on page 78 in the textbook, página 78, we were introduced to AR verbs, right? And how those verbs conjugate in the present tense. And your regular present tense endings, o, as, a, amos, an. Those are the endings used with AR verbs. And quite simple or straightforward. How do we conjugate a regular AR verb? We remove the stem, remove the ending, the last two letters. When you remove the ending from the infinitive, for example, the verb estudiar, remove the AR ending from the infinitive estudiar, you're left with what's called the stem. In this case, it would be estudi, and then you add to that stem your AR endings, as you can see on page 78, and then 79 gave you a whole bunch of infinitives, AR infinitives, that follow this pattern, O, as, a, amos, an. That's how we conjugate regular AR verbs. ER and IR verbs follow a similar pattern. This is on page 126. ER and IR verbs also conjugate by removing the ending, the last two letters, being left with the infinitive, in this case COM, and then there you have your ER and IR endings. These are regular AR, ER, and IR verbs. A stem changing verb, if we go back to page 161, stem changing verbs conjugate the same way. You'll notice that they have the same endings as AR verbs, ER verbs, and IR verbs, but what makes them unique is that they have a spelling change in their stem. That's why we call them stem changing, that there's some sort of spelling modification or change that takes place in their stem when we conjugate them. So that's what we're going to look at today. And a lot of these stem changing verbs inevitably are used to talk about daily activities, such as the verb to sleep. You can see that the verb dormir is an example of a stem changing verb. And we'll look at what that looks like a little bit later on. So the first type of verb that we're introduced to here in the book, and again, we're on page 161 if you're just joining us, is the verb empezar, which is the verb to begin. empezar is an AR verb that has a stem change, and that stem change is the vowel E, and usually the stem change happens like in the middle of the verb, right before the ending. That E, when conjugated, changes to IE. Empezar is to begin, but if I want to say I begin, I would change the E, second E, in the stem to IE. And you'll see at the very end of these conjugations, you still got o, as, a, amos, an. Same endings that we saw back on page 78. O, as, a, amos, an. The only new detail that we're being introduced to here is the stem change. Notice the stem change happens in every form, and as the notes say here, the first bullet point, every form has a stem change except for the nosotros form. Not sure why that is, but that is a feature that is universal for all stem changing verbs. All stem changing verbs have that spelling change except for in the nosotros form. It's another reason why we call these verbs boot verbs, because if you kind of draw, highlight the forms that have a stem change, it kind of makes this shape of a boot. So you may hear that as well from your level 2 teacher, boot verbs. Stem changing verbs and boot verbs are synonymous. They mean the same thing. So that's an example of a stem changing verb where the stem changes E to IE. Another example that the book gives here on 161 is the verb volver. Volver is the verb to return or come back. It's an ER verb. You can see it follows the regular ER endings there, O, S, E, emos, N. But again, as a stem changing verb, the O in volver changes to UE. Vuelvo, I return. Vuelves, you return. Vuelve, he or she returns. And then in the nosotros form, no stem change. Volvemos, we return. And then back to the stem change for the ellos, ellas, ustedes form. Yeah, so that's the verb empezar in the infinitive. You can see the stem, how it changes, and then utilizing that changed stem, that modified stem, how it would conjugate in all the different forms except for nosotros. Let's see, page 162 has some common stem changing verbs here. We see the verb dormir, the verb to sleep. Other verbs that you may recognize in this list, the verb querer, to want or to love. When we say yo quiero, right, we're changing the stem in the verb querer. I think that's probably about it that you would recognize right out of the gate. Jugar certainly is a verb that you recognize. Jugar deportes, to play sports. Jugar videojuegos, to play video games. Jugar baseball, basketball. You be specific about the sport. Jugar is a stem changing verb as well, and the U changes to UE. It's the only Spanish verb that has this type of stem change. The U changes to UE in every form except for the nosotros form. So the verb jugar in the nosotros form would be jugamos. But when conjugated in the different forms, it would be yo juego, J-U-E-G-O, juegas, juega, juegan. But again, in the nosotros form, jugamos. And the J again is like a soft H, like the English H, right? Aspirated, not voiced. Comenzar is a synonym, similar word for empezar that we saw earlier. If empezar is to begin, comenzar is to commence or start. And the verb pensar, finally here, it's part of the list on page 162, is to think. This is a very common verb used in Spanish, obviously, being the verb to think, especially as you get to level 3 when you're giving your subjective opinions. And also we use it to talk about making plans or intentions to do something, to think about do something. For example, ¿piensan ir al gimnasio? Are you guys thinking of planning to go to the gym? ¿En qué piensas? What are you thinking about? So common stem changing verbs here. You can see how they change. The verb pensar, I to IE. The verb comenzar, I to IE, just like empezar. And the verb jugar, U to UE. These are called stem changing verbs because there's some sort of spelling modification or change in their stem that takes place in every form except for the nosotros form, and they still follow the same conjugation pattern that we saw for the regular AR, ER, and IR verbs on page 79 and page 126. All right, let's do a little practice now. The inténtalo we're going to knock out now, which is the guided practice, and then I'll walk you guys through the pair practice. I'll give you guys the answers at the end, so if you guys want to pause the video, knock it out, and then check your answers to see how you did, that would be a good idea. Inténtalo. Let's try it. Provide the present tense forms of these verbs. So just as you can see in the example, take the verb cerrar, which is the verb to close. See how the stem changes. Account for that in every form, except for the nosotros form or nosotras form. And then use your regular present tense endings, o, as, a, amos, an. You're going to do the same thing for the verb dormir, the verb to sleep, the verb that you guys used in your warm-up. Yeah? Here in the to form in the question, here in the yo form in the response. And then do the same thing where you're going to conjugate it according to the subject provided, factoring in the stem change, as you can see in this first example, but don't make that stem change in the nosotros form. So go ahead and pause here if you want to knock these out, and I'll give you the answers in just a moment. All right, let's take a look at cerrar first. All right, so for the verb cerrar, ustedes cierran, tú cierras, nosotros cerramos, mi hermano cierra. Excuse me, no spelling change for no stem change for number 3. Cerramos. Yo cierro, usted cierra, los chicos cierran, ella cierra. For the verb dormir, yo no duermo, tú no duermes. Remember, this is an IR verb, so you don't want to use the same endings as an AR verb. If you put duermas, that conjugation exists in Spanish, but that's subjunctive. You won't cover that until level 3. Instead of duerma, should be duermes, right? Because we're using ER and IR verbs, such as, ER and IR endings, such as those on page 126. Very common mistake to kind of overextend or mix up rather the endings. So number 3 again, duermes. Number 4, mis hijos no duermen. Usted no duerme. Nosotros no dormimos. No stem change. For number 6, leave the O as is. Number 7, él no duerme. Y por fin, número 8, ustedes no duermen. That's the inténtalo. If you got most of those right, well done. You guys are ready for sure for the pair practice. I'll walk you through each question, and again, at the very end, I'll give you the correct answer so you can check and see how you did. Completar. Página 163. Complete this conversation with the appropriate forms of the verbs. Act out the conversation with your partner. That'd be awesome if you guys did that. So you can do one part. Your partner can do the other. Verbs are provided in parentheses. And remember, this is a conversation, so the default assumption is that any questions are going to be in the to form, right? Because it's a one-on-one conversation, right? Questions in the to form, responses in the yo form. kind of back and forth, just like that, as we've seen with any example conversation that we've done. Unless another subject's provided, you can assume that those are the forms to be used. So, Oscar, voy al centro ahora. If you want to knock this out with your partner, you can. I'm going to go ahead and give the correct answers now. ¿A qué hora piensas, P-I-E, piensas volver? El partido de fútbol is your subject. I want to say it begins. That would be the LA form. El partido de fútbol empieza. Empieza a las 2. And then make sure you're changing the E to I-E. En empezar. Pablo responding to Oscar. Vuelvo a la 1. Quiero ver el partido. I want to see the game. I want to watch the game. Recordar is similar to volver, where the O changes to UE. In the form of a question, Oscar says, ¿recuerdas? Remember. ¿Recuerdas que nuestro equipo es muy bueno? This one is an exclamation point. I think he's saying we can win. It's kind of tricky to understand the subject that's intended here, but this really should be the nosotros form. He's saying we can win. Podemos ganar. No need for a stem change in the nosotros form. Podemos ganar. We can win. No, Pablo says to respond. Yo pienso que va a... Number 8's tricky. Oof. For the folks that are hella locked in, you're like, I recognize this. This is the construction ir a infinitive. I recognize va. Va is a conjugation of the verb ir, which is on page 158, what we looked at just a couple weeks ago. And I remember that the construction ir a infinitive, the verb ir, a infinitive, is to express, right here, ir a infinitive is to express a future action. So back to this activity, number 8 would be va a, and then perder is going to stay in the infinitive, right? Because it's being utilized as the infinitive in this construction, the simple future, to talk about future actions. If the light bulbs are going off, they're very well done. If you're a little confused by that, understandable. But I think for the majority of you, I hope that you can see and recognize why perder doesn't conjugate, because it should be left in the infinitive. Finally, number 9, los jugadores de Guadalajara son salvajes cuando juegan. Juegan. Guys, this is level 2 stuff. If you're able to navigate this, all you're having to do is factor for the stem change, but in terms of the conjugations, if you're navigating this relatively well or really well, you're doing great. This is level 2 territory that we're in now. All right, video's getting a little long here, geeking out a little too much with you. Let's go ahead and wrap up 2 and 3, and we'll get you going for your next period. And again, no homework at all due for today. Remember, there's a project I gave you guys the outline for, not due until May 14th, 15th. You got time, but man, since we just finished the speaking and the answers to the project should be fresh, please go ahead and begin to work on that, especially when you have no homework for the weekend. Enjoy your 3-day weekend, by the way. No school on Monday. All right, número 2, with a partner. Take turns asking and answering questions about what these people want to do. So you are going to conjugate the verb querer, and then the verb that's provided, you're going to conjugate the verb querer according to the subject. That's step 1. And then the verb that's provided, you're actually going to leave in the infinitive aka not conjugated, because when we have two verbs together in Spanish, and English for that matter, we conjugate the first, but we leave the second in the infinitive. For example, ¿quiere estudiar Guillermo? Does Guillermo want to study? So conjugate the verb querer in the subject that's provided at the beginning. Your conjugations of querer are going to be quiero, quieres, quiere, as you see. Queremos, spelt Q-U-E-R-E-M-O-S, no stem change in the nosotros form. That's queremos, and then finally, ellos, ellas, ustedes quieren. So, quiere estudiar Guillermo, and then you're going to use the verb preferir, which conjugates just like querer. Stem changes from E to IE in preferir. Conjugate the verb preferir according to the same subject that's provided at the beginning. Unless it's tú or ustedes, and I'll show you what that would look like in a moment. So I'll pause and then give the correct answers for activity 2. All right, número 1. ¿Tú quieres trabajar? No. And then since this is in the to form, the response will be in the o form, similar to how we saw in the activity number 1, questions in the to form, response in the o form. The response would be no. Yo prefiero dormir. I prefer to sleep instead of working. Fair enough. For número 2, ¿ustedes quieren mirar la televisión? Y'all want to watch TV? Since the question's in the ustedes form, the response is going to be in the nosotros form, right? If ustedes is asking more than one person, then more than one person would respond in the first person plural, nosotros. ¿Ustedes quieren mirar la televisión? No. Nosotros preferimos. Preferimos. No stem change in the nosotros form. No. Nosotros preferimos pasear nosotros preferimos jugar al dominó. ¿Tus amigos quieren ir de excursión? No. Mis amigos prefieren descansar. ¿Tú quieres comer en la cafetería? No. Yo prefiero ir a un restaurante. ¿Elisa quiere ver una película? No. Elisa prefiere leer una revista. ¿María y su hermana quieren tomar el sol? No. María y su hermana prefieren practicar el esquí acuático. All right, last activity. Describe what these folks are doing using the stem changing verbs. So you're going to pick a verb that matches the picture and then conjugate it accordingly. These are the verbs almorzar, to have lunch, cerrar, to close, contar, to tell, or to count rather, dormir, to sleep, encontrar, to find, and mostrar, to show. O to UE, E to IE, O to UE, O to UE, O to UE, and O to UE. Those are the stem changes that take place with these verbs. Número 1, yo cierro la ventana. You can add that last part if you want to, but just the verb's fine. Las niñas duermen. Pedro muestra una foto. Tú Let's see a verb that really matches there. Tú encuentras tu pelota. You find your golf ball. I would use the verb jugar here. Tú juegas golf. Juegas would be a better verb here. I don't know why they don't use the verb jugar. Nosotros almorzamos. No stem change. The O stays in the nosotros form. And then finally, Teresa cuenta.